Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Psychedelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicines, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is Dustin Robinson. Dustin has a master's in accounting and a law degree from the University of Florida, and his extensive experience includes times as a corporate litigator and a general counsel / CFO. Now, in 2018, Dustin became the founding partner of Mr. Cannabis Law, which provides legal advice to companies in the cannabis and psychedelic space. He's also the founder of the Eater Fund, a venture capital fund investing across the psychedelic ecosystem. Now, speaking of founding things, as if that wasn't enough, Dustin also founded Mr. Psychedelic Law, a nonprofit with a mission of driving legal reform around psychedelic medicines, and is a founder of Nucleus, a venture capitalist studio that funds and launches companies in the psychedelic space. I can also see by looking at your LinkedIn profile, which is really well put together, Dustin, that you recently spoke at an event with one of our recent guests, and I have to say one of my all-time favorite people, the awesome Dr. Molly Maloof. So it is wonderful to have you on the show. Welcome to the Psychedelics podcast.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and Molly is a good friend, so I know I'm in good company joining the show.
I love it. I want to be best friends with both of y'all forever because you're all doing amazing work. Let's talk a little bit before we get into our conversation about where we're at on our journey as the Psychedelics podcast host and audience. We have so far spoken to scientists like Manesh Gurn and Marcus Glennon, who really explain to us some of the fundamentals about what psychedelics and plant medicine are, how they impact the brain, and can create new pathways that can change people's lives and help them heal from a whole variety of challenges. We've spoken to journalist David Cox, who has given us a deeper understanding of the fact that psychedelic medicines and plant medicines aren't quackery or hocus pocus like a lot of folks, including me, kind of thought that they might be. We've also spoken to regular folks like Mark McNally and Lois Kofi, who have told us true stories about how having psychedelic experiences has helped them heal from traumas that have been, in some cases, bordering on the unbelievable. Molly Maloof, who we just mentioned a few minutes ago, had a great conversation with us about safety, which is something I think is so foundational to an understanding and to mind opening around psychedelics that we felt we couldn't, as a foundational matter, even begin to have this podcast without someone like her. Now, after listening to, talking to, absorbing everything that all of these folks have said, my mind, and I know the minds of so many audience members, have been opened by the possibilities and really rethinking how we might be emotionally reacting to those and whether this is something we would want to delve in further, whether for ourselves or for those that we care about in our lives. But I gotta say this, we all live in the real world, and that real world includes things like culture and society and the law. And so the next series of episodes, I think, is going to be really exciting, starting with yours, because we're going to start talking about a lot of these social and cultural issues that impact, as a matter of concern, I would say, to practically anyone. Once you get past the lack of medicinal knowledge or concerns about safety, nothing is more foundational to whether this is something to pursue further than the law. But before we get into the law itself, I have to know, how did you get into this space? General counsel, you worked for a law firm, huh?
Yeah, well, if you ask any of my college buddies, they would be quite surprised that I ended up in this particular category. I actually, back in my college days, didn't really do any drugs. So I never actually tried a drug up until 3 years ago. So I started my law firm, really, it was just by chance. I had just sold one of my companies that I was an owner in, and I was planning to take a year off. And I ran into some friends that had a cannabis license. They needed help doing a relatively complex commercial transaction. Decided to help them for free. I was kind of on my 1 year hiatus, and we were able to put together the transaction. They ended up sending me a referral. But before I knew it, I kind of just created this niche within the cannabis industry doing highly complex commercial transactions, because at the time, a lot of the big law firms, such as the previous law firm I worked for, Holland and Knight, they weren't getting involved in the space since cannabis is federally illegal. So really started a niche around that. And then the firm just very quickly grew. We have offices now in Florida, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. We're planning to open up California and Arizona shortly. And then in 2019, a lot of the doctors started reaching out to me. I represent a lot of doctors through my law firm, and they were interested in getting involved in psychedelics. And at the time, I never even tried a psychedelic. So I was quite surprised. I carried the stigma. I was certainly victim of some of the false social constructs around psychedelics. And I told them, after it was like 3 or 4 of them reached out to me, I'm like, there must be something here that these are like doctors reaching out. It's not my business clients. So
Right.
they shared some of the research. I geeked out on some of the research, like some of the stuff out of Imperial College of London, NYU, Johns Hopkins, Yale. And I was just blown away by what I was reading. And then started working with them prior to even trying psychedelics, just based on the research I was reading. I really found it very interesting. The cannabis space, there was very little research. A lot of my clients want to make claims about cannabis products. There is some research going on, but it's mainly anecdotal. In contrast, on the psychedelic space, there was just tremendous research going on. So it was something I wanted to get involved. So help them launch multiple ketamine clinics. We helped them, set up some research program with universities. Then I had my own psychedelic experience, and it was absolutely profound. The total opposite of what I'd always expected it to be, rather than being like a debilitating compound, which is what I thought it was. It turns your brain into mush. It actually was absolutely mind expanding. And that experience really was very pivotal for me in really drawing more passion and really getting behind the industry.
Well, you're pointing to something, by the way, that is interesting. We'll get to your personal experience in a moment, because I totally want to hear about it. I'm sure the audience does too. In fact, I have to. But let's talk a little bit about your experience in the cannabis space versus the psychedelic space, because one of the things that is interesting to me as a neophyte in this world is that cannabis, at least commercially and how it presents, has a little bit of a hocus pocus element to it. The data out there, at least to my limited degree of knowledge, is, like you said, not as specific and as comprehensive as I've been discovering exists for psychedelics. But not only that, cannabis seems to now suddenly be a cure-all for everything. Everything from my bad hair day to arthritis. And so it has a little bit faded into how some folks might be feeling about psychedelics, because psychedelics and cannabis have in common that they were at the center of, among some other things, the war on drugs. So there's this default association. Talk to us a little bit about what got you to understand that differentiation, and whether that has any implications for how a company or someone involved in psychedelics might ultimately deal with it from a legal perspective, should legal issues ever come up.
Yeah, so these compounds are very different in effect, in legality, in efficacy, and in safety. So where they're similar is they're both Schedule 1 on the Controlled Substances Act, right? So both cannabis and most of these psychedelic compounds, if not all of them, except for ketamine, are Schedule 1 on the CSA. But the main distinction that I make between the cannabis psychedelic space is that, in my opinion, when all the dust settles with cannabis in the next few years, what we're going to see is mainly an adult use / recreational market. I think 90% of the market will be there. There will be some sliver that is medical and or pharmaceutical, maybe 10% of the market. In contrast, the psychedelic space, in my opinion, the way we're seeing it progress right now, is really more through the pharmaceutical route, going through FDA clinical trials or Health Canada, whatever the respective jurisdiction is. So I believe when the dust settles on the psychedelic side, about 90% of the market is going to be mainly pharmaceutical or medical, with maybe a 10% sliver that's more entheogenic or spiritual, which is kind of like what we're seeing out in Oregon.
And I just want to ask 2 questions before we move on from that. A, can you just explain what Schedule 1 is? That term gets thrown around a lot, and I don't even know what it is. I have a law degree. What is it?
Yeah, so Schedule 1 compounds that are on Schedule 1, basically there's 2 main factors: that they have a high likelihood for abuse and no medicinal value, right? And it's pretty wild to even think of these psychedelic compounds, including cannabis. Cannabis does not have a high likelihood for abuse, and there is some medical value to cannabis as well. But psychedelics in particular, psilocybin, for example, which is the main compound of magic mushrooms, not highly addictive, not a high likelihood for abuse. You're not going to find people who are addicted to mushrooms, right? And we're finding that it does have tremendous medical value, so much so that the FDA, the agency in the United States, the federal agency that's responsible for assessing efficacy and safety in drugs, has actually designated psilocybin as a breakthrough therapy. So we're in a situation, as odd as it is, where the research is showing, as shown by the FDA, designate them as breakthrough therapies, that these compounds are efficacious for different medical uses and do have a great safety profile. Meanwhile, we have them Schedule 1, which by definition means that they do not have any medical value and have a high likelihood for abuse. So there's already this contrast that really is contradictory within the federal government. And MDMA is currently in phase 3 clinical trials. It was also designated as a breakthrough therapy through the FDA. And also MDMA is a Schedule 1 substance as well. So, upon approval by the FDA, not to get too down the road, but upon approval of MDMA, which we expect to be approved end of 2023, early 2024, what will happen is it will have to go to, basically the FDA approves it, then it goes to the DEA, and the DEA will have a certain amount of days to basically reschedule it as either Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. And at that point, there's also, I think, around 24, 26 states that don't automatically adopt the DEA scheduling program. So those states will also have to take affirmative steps to reschedule MDMA as well. But at that point, MDMA will be available as a pharmaceutical for PTSD, essentially throughout the United States.
And I want to make a point as the second matter before we move on to your story, that you actually are well positioned to be discussing both the legal ramifications and some of the economic ramifications that would come about because of this change in psychedelic status as a legal matter because of some of the studios that you're involved with. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that and what this would mean for psychedelics from a commercial perspective before we get back into your story and then go in more detail with regards to legal questions folks might have.
Once I started working legally with some of these doctors, I started recognizing that there needed to be legal reform. So in 2019, I founded my nonprofit, Mr. Psychedelic Law, focused on legal reform from a city and state perspective. But what I realized is that because that nonprofit was just simply funded by myself, I didn't want to take in any outside capital. What I realized is that I could go to the top of the mountain and scream as loud as I want, but without tremendous capital being deployed into the industry, into the research and the clinical trials, this industry really can't push forward. So that's when I decided to start investing my own capital, working with investors, and ultimately that evolved into what I have today, which is Eater Investments, which is a venture capital fund. We just closed a raise of a little over $20 million. By the end of the year, we'll be going back out to market, hoping to raise anywhere from $75 to $100 million. So, we're very actively involved in the space from, obviously from a legal perspective, from an advocacy perspective, but also from an investment perspective.
And just so someone who might be from, look, I've got family in Appalachia, and they're not familiar with a lot of these fancy money terms. So to break it down very clearly, if there is a company that is going to enter into the psychedelic space, they may come to your investment or to your venture studio and seek funding so that they can get launched and get out into the world.
Yeah, thus far we generally invest in seed or Series A round deals. Average check size is anywhere from 500 to $1 million. We currently have 16 companies in our portfolio. We should be closing on our next 2 deals within the next 30 days. The goal is to have around 20 to 22 companies in this first fund. Second fund will have a different strategy. But our goal is to create a diversified portfolio of various companies around mental health and psychedelic medicines.
Thank you so much for that. Now, let's get back to your story. Wholesome, clean-cut boy who's never done a drug in his life. Just the sort that someone would want to introduce to their mom.
Yes.
Now, you are doing psychedelics. And it was after, you said a little bit earlier, having talked to some of the doctors and having done some of the research and begun to understand the credibility of it. Nonetheless, then, if there was well, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it doesn't sound like there was a crisis that you were facing that led you into this. What exactly made you decide to do it then?
Yeah, honestly, it was a little bit of pressure from some of my clients. I was doing so much work in the space. I was representing so many groups. I was investing in the space, and they're like, "All right, it's time for you to have your first experience." And when I say it was a little bit of pressure from them, I willingly wanted to do it myself as well. And so my first experience was with psilocybin. I actually did that with my life coach, Matthew Savrick, who I've been working with for several years. And he's been absolutely instrumental in a lot of the success I've had from just a business and personal perspective. And, he was with me through that experience. He had plenty of experience, doing these compounds before. I knew I was in safe hands. And it was really during that experience that, quite frankly, we really charted out a future of launching a nonprofit, investing into the space, launching an investment fund, and doing, like you mentioned, I was just on a panel with Molly Malouf. Those are monthly panels we do with Soho House, where we do them at different Soho houses across the country. We actually manifested that on that day that we were going to do stuff like that. So, it really opens up your mind and helps you problem solve and understand the world from a completely different perspective.
And is that what you would say the big impact of the psychedelic experience has been for you, that sort of opening of the mind or reconceptualizing, maybe becoming more visionary or more creative, or is there something else too, or maybe that's not what the result in your life was at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very passionate about mental, physical, behavioral health and wealth.
Yeah.
These compounds collectively, they really have the ability to enhance your level of consciousness and expand your consciousness. And the biggest problem with the FDA clinical trials, in my opinion, there's plenty of problems, and everyone's got complaints about FDA clinical trials. But one of the issues for me is I'm very passionate about, like, people that don't have underlying conditions, that don't have a mental health indication, a clinical diagnosis. I think these could be useful when done responsibly. I really got to say, when done responsibly, it's very important. The extra pharmacological aspects of these compounds, the setting, dosage, are extremely important. But when done responsibly, they could be unbelievably transformational for people with no conditions. But in my opinion, right now, we're in a mental health crisis, and the people that we need to prioritize in this world are people that are really suffering. And it's really more so the research that I read as opposed to my experience that really got me passionate about trying to address this global mental health crisis. We have over 1 billion people that are suffering globally from some sort of mental health indication. So right now, my focus, especially within my fund, is to get access to those people that are really the most vulnerable in society, those that are suffering from some sort of mental health indication. Once we prove out the research with them and we've, gotten them access to these compounds, certainly, I believe that, we all have the right to control what goes into our mind and expand our own consciousness. And I don't think the government should be intervening in that. But right now, my prioritization is to get access to these medicines to those that are most vulnerable with these mental health indications.
Well, and bluntly, it's hard to argue with that sort of prioritization. What could any rational person say to that? Let me ask you this, though, before we roll up our sleeves and talk about those that might be facing those challenges and thinking, oh my gosh, are psychedelics right for me, or are they right for people that I care about? In a recent episode that was basically a debate between a man named Jonathan Lubecki and another figure in the psychedelic space by the name of Zappy Zappelin, a flashpoint came up with regards to decriminalization versus legalization. And as a lawyer, as a foundational matter, before I start asking specific questions, can you explain the difference between the two for anyone who might not understand exactly what that means?
Absolutely. First, I'll say that as my position in the industry, I like to really get different perspectives. And Zappy, you mentioned Zappy, he's actually one of my clients. I represent several of his businesses. And Zappy's kind of on one side of the spectrum. And I think that's great. We need people that are really kind of pushing the envelope. That's fine. I don't necessarily agree with all the stuff that Zappy says, but I'm open and understanding. I think that's the key, is to remain open-minded as you're drafting legal reform and you're trying to really chart a new path forward for this great brand new industry. It's important that you don't get too stuck in your own personal ideas. And so I really try to talk to as many different people as possible, get as many different perspectives as possible. So the main difference, so decriminalization and legalization often get confused. When Denver passed decriminalization, my law firm was getting, dozens of calls from people who thought they could start businesses around decriminalization. Decriminalization is basically just saying that it's going to be possession and use of these compounds is going to be the lowest priority for that particular city or state. Doesn't create a commercial market. So still illegal to sell or create a business around it. What you're allowed to do in a decriminalized market is you are allowed to possess and use. So you could grow your own, you could use your own, but even in those cities, it's important to remember that it still might be criminal from a state perspective, and it certainly is still criminal from a federal perspective. So even in a place like Santa Cruz, Oakland, Denver, any of these cities that decriminalize, even though you may be protected from city enforcement, you're still not necessarily protected from state and federal enforcement. Legalization, to be contrasted, is actually creating a commercialized market. And Oregon is the first state that has done that through Measure 109. They basically create a legalized market that's kind of like what we see in the cannabis space, even within Oregon, that has this legalized commercial market where you're going to be able to apply for grow licenses, service center licenses, facilitator licenses, and you'll be actually able, once you have one of these licenses, to administer psilocybin in Oregon. Still, much like cannabis, it's still federally illegal. So whether it's decriminalized or legalized from a city or state perspective, it's still important to understand that from a federal perspective, these compounds are still Schedule 1 and illegal.
And so that means, at least until there is some sort of harmony across the various jurisdictions that enforce these laws, anyone that wants to enter into a commercial transaction or begin a commercial entity or use these substances as a matter just for their own personal purposes needs to understand the full complexity of their legal risk, that is, and not necessarily assume that, okay, well, my hometown is okay with this, but that doesn't mean suddenly, the federal government couldn't swoop in one day. And not that it's likely to happen or not, but to at least be aware of that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in the cannabis space, we have something called the Cole Memo, which is essentially the federal government saying like, hey, we're not going to mess with cannabis companies as long as you kind of follow these, 7 or 8 priorities. We don't have that in the psychedelic space. So we still don't know how the federal government is going to look at Oregon's psilocybin market, whether they're going to refrain from enforcing or whether they're going to step in and do something. But certainly, regardless of that, much like cannabis, if you're operating in Oregon or any other future legalized market, you're going to have banking issues, you're going to have insurance issues, you're going to have a whole number of issues, which I'm all too familiar with working in the cannabis space with some of my clients.
Well, and then that really is a big deal. I mean, if you can't open a bank account, for instance, or if you are seeking to get some sort of license that you need and your business is something that is impacted by these various legalizations or criminalization statuses, then yeah, that could be a business challenge, I could imagine.
And it's interesting, there's such a misconception out there. We've invested into some very highly sophisticated enterprise, and our investment firm only invests in fully legal businesses. So mainly biotech companies doing, pharmaceutical drugs going through the proper FDA pathway or Health Canada or whatever jurisdiction they're in. Some of them are operating clinics that are delivering ketamine, which is a Schedule 3 compound, which is FDA approved drug. It's being used off label for various mental and behavioral health indications. Those clinics that are delivering ketamine are doing so 100% legally, as long as they're following, normal federal and state guidelines. But several of those companies we invested in were actually thinking about getting involved in Oregon. And I had to kind of, have some conversations with them where to explain to them, as soon as you guys get involved in Oregon, your entire business basically becomes subject to all sorts of different regulations, including 280E, which is a tax provision, which only allows you to deduct your cost of goods sold. So, I think there's a lot of people that want to get involved in this Oregon initiative and this Oregon commercial market, but it's very important that they understand the risks. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a tremendous opportunity. We're actually looking at some companies in Oregon, but it's also very important that they go into it understanding the full risk.
Right, keeping it real. Okay, let's ask some real people questions here. If I do them, and I know the answer is going to be complex, so to the best, and by the way, I assume you're not talking about, I'm not asking you for a specific legal advice about any particular case. This is all just hypothetical. So let's say I'm Joshua so-and-so. I decide to do them. Can I get fired if my employer finds out?
So quick disclaimer, this is not legal advice and I do not condone any illegal use of these compounds, but absolutely, it really depends. Number one, most workplaces have drug-free workplace policies. Even if you have a medical marijuana card, for example, in Florida does not have specific protections under their ADA statute that would protect someone who has a medical marijuana card using cannabis. So if you test positive for even cannabis, in certain states actually do have specific protections, other states don't. An employer could potentially terminate you. So a lot of these companies don't necessarily test for like psilocybin, for example, but to the extent that they do test for psilocybin and their drug-free workplace allows them to terminate someone for testing positive, absolutely, employer has the right to terminate an employee for testing positive for psilocybin, MDMA, cannabis, or any of these compounds. In exception for cannabis in certain states like Illinois that have specific protections for employees that are using marijuana.
And then that does go as to the next question I had for you. A lot of the folks that at least initially will be using psychedelics are using them right now, face some sort of mental challenge, a PTSD diagnosis, perhaps a depression diagnosis. And we're going to talk more about this as the season goes on, certain specific medical issues like end of life pain. Well, it's not like, I mean, who knows what your situation may be at your job if you're at the end of your life. But that being said, with some of these other mental health challenges that folks sometimes have, some people may say to themselves, well, perhaps my use or there's some protection that I could have because of Americans with Disability Act status. You're saying that may or may not be true.
No, it is not true. So right now in the United States, other than ketamine, no psychedelic compounds are FDA approved. And there's actually a process when you test positive with an employer that they actually, even if you get test positive for opioids, which is a legal pharmaceutical compound, if you test positive for opioids, they will ask you to provide your prescription of opioids. If you don't have a prescription for opioids, then you can be terminated. So the first thing they will do if you test positive for psilocybin, they'll say, show me your prescription for psilocybin. There's no prescription for psilocybin you'll be able to show because it's not an approved pharmaceutical compound, and therefore you will be terminated and there will be no protections. Regardless of whether you have end-of-life anxiety and you're self-medicating, you're still accessing those compounds illegally. Unless potentially you could be a part of a clinical trial. There are clinical trials right here in Fort Lauderdale, for example. Siegel Trials is doing clinical trials around psilocybin and various other psychedelic compounds, and those individuals that participate in those clinical trials are accessing those compounds legally. So that does throw a little bit of a wrinkle into the question. And I think there is a possibility that if you are accessing them legally through a clinical trial, perhaps there's an argument to be made that your employer cannot terminate you, but I do not know that for sure.
Yeah. Let's say I'm just doing this in the privacy of my own home, or I go over to my homeboy's house and we're like, let's say, just taking some mushrooms. Am I technically at risk should my next door neighbor decide to call the cops on me or something?
Yeah, I mean, even use in your own home is illegal. There's very little enforcement going on right now with respect to psychedelics, unless you're distributing tremendous amounts of them or someone gets injured or something like that. So, if you're consuming them in your own home, the likelihood of the DEA coming and knocking on your door is very low. But it is important to understand that you are being involved in an illegal activity by consuming them in your house.
And then let's even talk about enforcement more generally then. To what extent is this a law enforcement priority anywhere? I mean, are there literally police departments, and hey, there may well be, who are sitting around saying, I've heard a veteran is using XYZ because he doesn't want to kill himself. Let's go arrest him. Is that sort of stuff going on? And is there any sort of shift one way or the other in terms of police departments? Culturally, are there different state by state approaches that are going on with this, or is it generally laissez-faire?
Yeah, look, there's internet sites you could buy illegal psychedelic compounds on. There's actually some like dispensaries that are open illegally that are openly selling psilocybin mushrooms within the United States, right? And no one is doing anything about it. So the enforcement is very low. The DEA, all these governmental agencies, they do not have that many resources. They are limited. The resources are not infinite. They are finite. So they allocate resources to the highest priority stuff. And, they're not going out there. Their priority is not to go find a veteran. They're trying to bust, huge drug traffickers that are bringing in kilos of product into the United States and that are, doing real crime and real violence around that trafficking. That's really what their focus is. However, I did see a story with a rabbi who was operating some sort of a business where he was providing psychedelic medicine to those that wanted it. And I think he actually got arrested. So there's certainly some risk involved. And then also a whole other aspect that we haven't touched upon is the Religious Freedom Act, RFRA. And, there's an abundance of churches that are opening up. And most of those churches arguably are not operating pursuant to the DEA guidelines that were released just a couple of years ago. And that's a whole other legal issue that happy to get into, but that's a whole other issue.
No, I very much want to get into it. As a matter of fact, some ESP might have been going on here, because that was literally the next issue that I wanted to talk about. We both know this. Hopefully I'm not saying anything controversial. Religious liberty for the past 5-10 years has been one of the hottest legal and emotional and political issues that there is. And people have had arguments that have gone up to the US Supreme Court about whether they need to bake a cake for LGBTQ couples. Right, there are people that can claim to be part of religious traditions that have gone back since before white people were ever in the United States that are using these sorts of things. Is there litigation going on with regards to whether enforcement in the circumstances that you're talking about with these churches or other religious institutions is violating religious liberty, but especially because religious liberty as a legal concept, as I'm understanding it with the current U.S. Supreme Court, is expanding its scope. Am I crazy here?
Yeah, so the DEA actually passed some guidelines just a couple years ago that basically now require, if you want to run a church using a Schedule I compound, you actually have to apply to the DEA, and there's a whole form you have to fill out. And two of the conditions are quite contradictory, and there's actually a lawsuit going on right now. One condition is that you need to show that essentially you need this medicine in order to properly practice your religion. So it's like a necessity. But then another condition of applying is that you need to stop using that medicine while the DEA is looking at your application. So it's almost like by virtue of complying with stopping using your medicine during their review of the application process, which, by the way, they haven't approved any applications and they're taking their merry time. So it might take several years. You need to not be using this medicine. So it really, those guidelines just don't make any sense. And right now the DEA is being sued. There's various litigation going on around those DEA guidelines. And most churches are just opening up, ignoring that application from it to the DEA. They are operating under their own measures as a church. I was just in Austin, Texas. You mentioned that panel I was on with Molly. Did that at Soho House in Austin. And I was just blown away about the amount of churches they have in Austin. Austin has a tremendous psychedelic community. I actually went with Molly to one of the psychedelic churches on the Saturday night that I got in town. And it's absolutely unbelievable, the community that's building out in Austin. And there's just an abundance of these psychedelic churches opening up out there.
Now, we're going to discuss this more in the future in a separate episode or two, it's sort of interesting for me look, I was born and raised in red state America, conservative religious background, to hear about a religious community being built up around this. That, to me, is something I can't wait to explore in a future episode. I'm sure you and I could talk about that for hours. But let me ask you another question. What if I go overseas and do them in a place that's perfectly legal?
Yeah, look, all these different countries have different laws around them, whether it be Mexico, Costa Rica, wherever it might be. We've invested in different jurisdictions depending on the laws in those states. But yeah, what's determinative is the law, the country that you're in. So if you go to Mexico and you go to a retreat that's administering psilocybin legally, and I wouldn't necessarily call it legally because it's kind of just unregulated out there, but it's not illegal out there. You're not committing any crime in the US. You're doing something 100% legally within that country. That's why these retreats are actually starting to gain in popularity, and there's actually tremendous demand at these retreat centers. Our fund has probably diligenced several dozen of these retreats, and it's actually quite impressive the amount of demand there is for people to access these medicines in these other countries.
But let me talk to you about another legal issue. We are having this conversation in the United States, and this particular topic is something in the United States we're really, really big on. I'm not big on it. I kind of hate it, but it's a reality. That is lawsuits. If I'm going to some dispensary or I see some shaman, we're not talking about overseas where it's legal, where they may have a separate infrastructure to deal with these things legally, and something happens. Can I sue?
Yeah, look, I always remind people could sue for whatever they want. I mean, you could go into a doctor's office that's, prescribing anything, and if they were negligent in what they did, you could sue them. So certainly if you're someone practicing underground as a shaman and you're delivering psychedelic medicine or, perhaps ibogaine, which has a little bit more cardiovascular risk, and someone were to die or something were to happen, absolutely, them or their family, if they're dead, would certainly have a cause of action against you in litigation. So it definitely is relatively high risk from, potential civil liability perspective. So, right. So most of what we've talked about thus far is criminal liability. Civil liability is a totally different issue, people suing people. And certainly if something bad were to happen, you could be sued. Just recently, there was a wedding in Florida where they actually served cannabis and some people didn't know about it and they ended up consuming too much and they ended up getting sick. Those people who attended the wedding ended up suing. So, if you're providing someone with illegal substances, especially if they're unaware of it, you certainly have the potential of being sued.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like being told what I'm going inside my mouth. I like having some idea of it. So, okay, let's just talk about how can someone stay on top of all this? Because I'm sure it's developing day by day. This will be evergreen to some extent, but it will not be evergreen forever. The landscape is shifting. Otherwise, the very fact that your companies are investing in this indicates that. So where can we go to just sort of stay on top of it all?
Yeah, well, number one is Webdelics. That's a good place to start, right? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you said that because I was going to, but it's always better to hear it from you.
But no, it's also a good segue into what we're doing at Nucleus, our venture studio. So our investment fund invests mainly in the biotech side of the industry, but what we recognized is that there was a tremendous interest from people being interested in psychedelics, whether it's from a patient perspective, investor perspective, therapist perspective. And then you had this industry that we were investing in, these academic institutions, these companies doing these clinical trials, and there was a lack of connection between the two. So the concept with Nucleus is that we're launching multiple assets that are connecting the people to the industry. So that's what our venture studio is focused on. So for example, we have an asset called psychedelicinvest.com. We're connecting people interested in investing with companies that are interested in passing their message to investors, right? So psychedelicinvestors.com is just like a website where you could get tremendous information if you're interested, data and analytics on investing in the psychedelic space. We also have another asset called Matter Academy, where it's basically for clinicians or therapists that want to take courses. We basically are a course aggregator. We aggregate all the different courses in the psychedelic space. So if you're interested in finding a course, we're connecting people interested in education and courses, therapists and clinicians with, those course providers. So we've got already about 5 or 6 assets. We're launching another 3 assets that are similar to that are really connecting people to industry. So if you're interested in learning more, it's withnucleus.com. Withnucleus.com will kind of direct you to all of our different assets that we have.
I love it. Now, one last question, and then we're going to find out a little bit more about how folks can reach you or connect with you or otherwise find out about all these things that you're doing. Do you ever see a day in which just regular street use or unregulated, just let me just pick it up and buy it, assuming I'm over 18 or something like that? Do you ever see that sort of situation arising in the United States at least, or maybe even other parts of the Western world?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, in Oregon, they passed Measure 109, which is their commercialized legal framework, but Measure 110 essentially decriminalized all compounds, even cocaine. So it's kind of like the approach they're taking in Portugal, where everything. So in Oregon, they already are living in a world, and quite frankly, it's a social experiment. I'm not necessarily advocating for that approach. I'm not against that approach. We'll see. The states, at the end of the day, through the 10th Amendment of our Constitution, they're supposed to be laboratories of experimentation. And what Oregon is doing out there is absolutely an experimentation. It's a social experimentation. I'm very interested to see how that works out. But their concept is we rather decriminalize these compounds and not put people in jail, but instead get them help. If we find people on the street who are addicted to heroin, who are doing heroin, let's not put them in jail. Let's try to put them in a rehab center and let's try to actually get them help. So it's already happening. Whether we'll see that widespread throughout the United States, I think we're very, very far away from seeing any sort of world where, they're totally decriminalized from a federal perspective and we're able to access them like that. But I do think, we are seeing a lot of different states like California, as well as Florida. My nonprofit actually filed a bill to legalize psilocybin 2 legislative sessions ago. We filed a new bill this past legislative session. We have another bill we're planning to file in this next legislative session. But states are, at least putting forth bills to create these legalized frameworks. So I do think there's a possible world where we're living in where, multiple states have passed some sort of legalized framework. It's also important to note that even under the Oregon framework, these medicines need to be administered at a service center. So in the cannabis space, you pick it up from a dispensary and you're actually required in most states like Florida to consume it in the privacy of your home. You can't consume them in public. In the psychedelic space out in Oregon, the way it's worked out is that it's the opposite. You actually have to have them administered and consumed at the service center. You cannot take them home. So, it's still a very regulated, even under the Oregon model, it's still very, very highly regulated and limited as to how you could consume these compounds.
If there's one takeaway that I'm going to be moving away from this conversation with, and there's been a lot in it, is that this is a rapidly changing landscape that we're living in. It's important to stay on top of what's going on. There are risks, but things are changing, and there does seem to be a general trend towards social acknowledgement of the real medical validity of these medicines and the need to access them through the legal system that we have. And you've really given us a lot to chew on. Dustin, where can people find out more about you? I just can't imagine that after hearing you talk, people aren't going to be compelled to follow you or want to connect.
Yeah, I mean, if best place, I guess you could go to my investment fund website, Eater Investments. That's ITER Investments. That's investmentsplural.com, eaterinvestments.com. You click contact us, get in touch with me through there. You also follow me on Instagram, Dustin R10. I do a lot of events. I do, several panels every single week. I got different podcasts and panels I'm doing, and most of that stuff gets posted on my Instagram social media. So that's DUSTINR and the number 10.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing, and I really appreciate you being on the show. Now, for those of you who are listening and watching, keep tuning in because in upcoming episodes, as mentioned earlier, we're going to be discussing a lot more deeply some of these social concerns, including some of the issues that we discussed in passing during the conversation today. We're also going to be talking about things like public policy and psychedelics, as well as economics and psychedelics, specifically what the intersection of medicine and commerce will look like in the plant medicine space. Again, some of which, Dustin, you've talked about very briefly. We're also going to be sharing more and more unbelievable stories about lives transformed by psychedelics and plant medicine. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe and leave a review or a comment and tell the folks that you care about what we're doing. And then don't forget to follow Webdelics on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And be sure to check out our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. And sign up for our blog. Then join us next time for another episode of the Webdelics Podcast.